In this episode, we're going to be dealing with music theory. We're going to talk about the tendency tone. What is it? Why is it important? How can it help you better understand music? How can it help you destroy tonality? These are all questions we're going to get into today. Welcome to the UreMusic Mentor podcast. I'm Kevin Ure, and I'm here to train your ear. I'm an author of several textbooks on music composition, ear training, and music theory. I've served as a music theory professor and currently run the composer studio over at UreMusic.com. I aim to make music education accessible and provide deeper insights into the nature of music. Please like, subscribe, and find us on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. What are tendency tones? We're going to talk about that today. If I play a major scale and I stop there, where do you want that note to go? Doesn't it feel like it's incomplete? Some of you, this is driving crazy right now. I love doing this to my students when I was teaching at the university. Go ahead and sing where it wants to go. Yeah, it wants to resolve up. It has a tendency to resolve up. And the seventh scale degree of every major scale is known as a leading tone. In minor, natural minor, you actually have to raise it a half step to become a leading tone. So it has to have this half step relationship. That's a half step. This is a whole step, by the way. So this half step relationship at the end of the scale, it pushes us back to the tonic. And that's what gives us tonality in a large way. If we have this C major scale, hit that leading tone and it goes up, it feels resolved. Now, one of the things that we can point out here is other scale degrees don't have the same tendency to want to move. Let's go ahead and start on our C major scale again and end on the fifth scale degree. That fifth scale degree, I don't know, maybe it wants to come back home, but by itself, it's pretty happy to just stay there. It doesn't feel like it needs to go anywhere. It's not a tendency tone. But if you build chords on the first scale degree, so you add notes within the major scale, so scale degree 1, scale degree 3, and scale degree 5, and you build a 1 chord there, that's your tonic chord. We call it home bass in a way, the home of the key. And then you build a chord on the fifth scale degree, so you get the notes G, the seventh scale degree, which is your leading tone, and you feel how it wants to move home. And then you have scale degree 2. That's your 5 chord, the dominant chord. All of a sudden, when you play them in relation to each other, the 1 chord, move into the 5 chord, that 5 chord wants to come home. Where does it want to go? Back to the 1 chord. And it feels like a cadence. So it's not the 5, it's not scale degree 5 that makes us want to come home, it's a 7th scale degree that creates that tension that needs to resolve back to a C, and that gives us the sound of home bass. So tendency tones are tones that have a certain need to resolve. So the first tendency tone you've learned about is a leading tone. There's one other tendency tone we need to talk about. So in that scale again, if I have a tonic triad, that's C, E, G, scale degree 1, 3, and 5, and then I go to the 5 chord, and I just spell a triad, 5, 7, and scale degree 2, G, B, and D. If I then add scale degree 4 on top of that, all of a sudden, we want to move again. Where does he want to go? Does he want to go up or down? Where does that scale degree want to go? It could go up. Does that sound right? Or does it want to go down? It feels like it wants to go down. But when it goes down, the whole chord has to move. So that's actually our second scale degree, the 7th of a 5 chord. It has a tendency to want to come down. So you can think of it as a 4th scale degree in a major scale, C, D, E, F. In this case, G, B, D, F is the top of the chord, and it wants to come back down, and it feels resolved. So we have two tendency tones. The most impactful tendency tones are going to be the leading tone and the chordal seventh in a dominant seventh chord. But really, all seventh chords have a tendency tone that has a need to kind of come down. So this is kind of an explanation of what a tendency tone is. And once you understand this, you really understand music theory a lot better. It takes you past just understanding your key signature, scales, chords, and now we're learning something really substantial. So let's talk a little bit about the historical context. So to understand the role of a tendency tone in music history, it's very helpful to look at the historical development. So tendency tones have really been a crucial element in Western music. It's important to know this, particularly during the common practice period, which spans from approximately 1600 to 1900. And I mean, you can get specific, you could say 1908, I mean, you can change these dates a little bit, but we're talking generally 1600 to 1900. During this time, composers like Johann Sebastian Bach, Ludwig van Beethoven, Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, they utilized tendency tones to create tension and resolutions in their compositions. Without tendency tones, music didn't move forward. It really creates this need for tension and resolution. So we've talked about the leading tone. That's a good example. It's a 7th scale degree that leads to the tonic. This creates a sense of anticipation. And then when we come back to the C, we get resolution. This was a fundamental and still is a fundamental aspect of tonal harmony. If we go back to the Baroque period, Bach's chorales, they often showcase the use of tendency tones. So the leading tone would resolve to the tonic in a lot of cases, and the 7th of a chord would resolve downward by step, just like we saw in our dominant 7 chord. It would resolve down. Whereas in this actual chord, we got G, B, D, and F. The B and the F, the B comes up to a C, and the F comes down to an E, and we get this chord. We get a resolution. So tendency tones are really important, and they were used as far back as the Baroque period. So moving into the classical period, composers like Mozart and Beethoven continued to use these principles, but with more complexity and greater nuance. So moving forward in broad strokes as we get into the Romantic era, composers like Richard Wagner and Johannes Brahms began to experiment with chromaticism. So this introduces more pitches that acted as tendency tones. We don't talk about this too much, but in the Romantic period, new tendency tones were actually starting to get introduced. So there are more tendency tones. It's really a tendency tone is anything that has a tendency to want to resolve. It creates tension and needs to resolve. And this pushed the boundary of traditional harmony. So by understanding a little bit about the historical context, it helps us to appreciate how these tendency tones have shaped the music that we know and love today. You know, it's a really important thing. They're not just theoretical concepts, but actual practical tools that when you understand how to use them correctly can shape the way that you compose, and it can also affect the way you listen to music, because now you understand, when you really develop that ear, how certain decisions in composition affect the outcome. It's not purely intuitive. I mean, trusting your intuition when composing is a huge part of composing, I believe, but I also think that having kind of this second nature, automatic understanding of music theory helps you avoid repeating the music of a greater composer or a past composer, and it helps you create something new. So music theory is really important that way. And we can use these tools to evoke emotion and drive musical narratives. You can be much more effective when you understand how and not just hear how. If you understand how something affects a composition. Like if you understand, if you just can hear this, you hear this chord here, and you know it wants to resolve here, that's great. But if you understand why, because of the tendency tones, that gives you an even deeper understanding. It makes you use it much more intelligently in your musical works. So let's talk a little bit more about function. So tendency tones generally function to bring about cadences. We have scale degree 7 and scale degree 4. So we've got the leading tone and the subdominant. Those are the names for those scale degrees. In both major and minor keys, when you have a leading tone or a subdominant, they create a tritone. If I space it this way with the 4th in the bottom, scale degree 4 in the bottom, and the leading tone, scale degree 7 on top, then these guys, they want to resolve outwards. They move out into a 6. If I invert it, I now put my F on top, my B on the bottom. They want to resolve inwards. But there's still the same resolution. So in this example, the F and the B, the F is going down to an E, remember that. The B is going up to C, remember that. E and C is where they resolve. So the 4th, the augmented 4th, goes out into an E and a C. If I put it the other way, the 4th scale degree comes down to E, same note. The B comes up to C. So they're resolving to the same pitches, they've just been inverted. So now our diminished 5th still resolves in the same way. So this is really what tendency tones do in music. They create this tension that needs to be resolved, and that helps keep the music moving forward. So how do you recognize tendency tones in a musical passage? If you have a melody that's playing, listen for the end of the phrase. Because at the end of the phrase, you might have something like a 1 chord, it might go to a 4, and then it might go to a 5. You can hear your tendency tone here, and then it would resolve to 1. If you got a 7th chord, same progression. Listen for things like this. Your 1 chord, going to a 4 chord. Here's your 5 chord. With the 4th scale degree, the 7th of the chord. Here's 4th scale degree, here's the leading tone. They still want to resolve the 7th scale degree, or not the 7th scale degree. The 7th scale degree is a leading tone, that wants to go up, and the 4th scale degree wants to come down to an E. And so this chord here wants to do this. And it's a stronger resolution. So when you're listening to cadences, when you're listening to classical music or anything like this, listen for the ends of phrases and see if you can hear those tendency tones. And get the sheet music and look for those tendency tones. That will help you start to hear cadences more clearly. And you'll start to very clearly recognize the difference between a 5/7 chord and a 5 chord. Just a triad versus a 7th chord. So I hope that you enjoyed this discussion. If you want to find out more information, there's more information over on my YouTube channel and over at UreMusic.com. You can learn a lot more about this. Before I let you go, I just like to summarize some of the key points. So tendency tones, they have a tendency to want to resolve. The 2 most common ones in classical, baroque, romantic music are going to be the leading tone, which is the 7th scale degree, and the chordal 7th of a 5/7 chord, so a dominant 7 chord, is going to be the 4th scale degree. The leading tone wants to resolve up, the 4th scale degree wants to resolve down, and together they create a resolution that's very impactful and creates very powerful cadences. So as we get into future episodes, I'm going to talk about more theory concepts. We're going to kind of build on this. So it's actually very useful to go through this podcast in order, because I'm not going to introduce a really complex topic before I've talked about it on a lesser level, like what we're talking about now. We're just talking about tendency tones. They're very powerful, they're very important, but we go way beyond tendency tones in music theory. So I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I just want to let you know that you can go to my website, UreMusic.com, or you can watch the video of these over on YouTube if you're not already doing that. And I'd like to invite you to subscribe and leave feedback so that I know what kinds of things you'd like me to address, because this is really your podcast. Right now I'm answering questions based on what I've received as a professor when I taught for about 8 years at both the undergraduate and graduate level. And I'm answering the most common questions that often stump students. But I'd love to hear your questions as well so that we can include those. So go ahead, send them any way you can, and if it's a good question or it's a question that I think needs to be answered, I will definitely make a point to answer it in one of these podcasts in the future. Thank you.